Boardroom Bound, Episode 106. Recognize the Importance of Gender Diversity in a Boardroom with Diane Pattison.
If people are a great fit, they provide value, and they've done their due diligence to really understand the board members, and the board members have done the same, it's going to be a good fit. But if you're so aggressive that you're not paying attention to warning signs, then the worst thing you can do is get on a board and it doesn't work at all.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Diane Pattison. Diane has a fascinating story about being one of the few female executives in the room at several major organizations, and the relationship that she built there with some leading people led years later to great board opportunities. And we talk a lot on this show about the importance of networking. This is someone who did it very well, but has carved out not only several paid board roles, but gives back by several nonprofit boards. And you'll hear how all of that ties in with the networking, but also feeds her as an individual. Let's jump into the show. Diane Pattison, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thank you, Alexander. It's just a pleasure to be on with you today.
Well, I'm excited because we're going to be sharing stories with our listener, not just about doing well in their career, but you're also, I want to say, doing well for others while you're doing that well in your career, which is really heartwarming on the one hand for me, but I think a good example for a lot of us. How do we use our time and our talents and figure out where we share that within our story and how we want to do it? And before we get to all that sort of fun stuff, though, I'd love for our audience to hear a bit of your background and experience that led to the point where you were on multiple sort of paid company board roles, multiple nonprofit board roles, some of which are amazing organizations in and of themselves. So if you can walk us through some of the beginning of the career arc, that would be really helpful.
Sure. Well, you could say, sort of chapter one, it was my upbringing on a family-owned business on a farm in Oregon. And so at the age of 5, I started working and interacting with the public, and my dad gave me lots of responsibilities. So that was sort of the beginning of my career. And then I went on to Oregon State University and off to Harvard Business School. And after that, went to work for Trammell Crow Company, which is a commercial real estate development company and a subsidiary now of CBRE today. But I ended up being the COO of the services business for Trammell Crow, which was a Fortune 1000 company. And then I oversaw global client services, which was about a $600 million business, 4,500 employees for CBRE. And then I went on to be the global COO of Prologis. And they are, again, a Fortune 500 company like CBRE. And in all 3 cases, I was on the global executive team and the only woman in the room. So it was a great 21-year experience career-wise. I knew I was there for a reason, to provide a perspective that wasn't in the room. I felt comfortable with working with men, but I knew I needed to change the look of that room. And so that drove me a little bit towards what I do today in Founding Forward.
And so tell us about that today, right? So some of those background experiences that made you think, I have more that I could be doing and giving, led to this movement, is what I would call it.
Yeah, I just felt like women in the workplace needed to have a community where they could bring their whole self, their professional, relational, and spiritual together, and be encouraged by others like them. And have the ability to really understand why God had gifted them that way so that they could actually have a huge influence and impact on the workplace where they were. And today we launched in 2011 with a website, a book called Work, Love, Pray, and a local group. And today we have 155,000 women that are a part of Forward, which is the number 4 wordwomen.org.
That's quite a scale that you've moved up to very quickly. Any business would be proud of those sorts of results. And it's interesting, Diane, the skill set that you will have learned doing this. So let's call that leading a nonprofit. And I think there are many people listening to this show that think nonprofit boards, either that's exactly what I want to do in my spare time. It's a way to give back, to use the skills I've learned in the business world. Other people think that is a way that I can get some board experience and use that to step up. And there's quite a range. So, for example, I know one of your earlier boards was on the foundation from the undergrad institution that you went to. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about like how that started for you, what that experience was like, and maybe how that translates and compares to some of the for-profit board roles that you're on.
Yeah, that's a great question, Alexander. I went to Oregon State University, and it was really about 10 years ago that the dean of the business school reached back to me and asked me to be involved in her Dean Circle of Excellence, which then I became chair of that sort of advisory board. And I think that was when the reconnection with the foundation board of trustees came about. And it's been a great experience, I would say, for sort of 3 key reasons. One, the leadership is amazing, and the network of the leaderships as trustees for Oregon State University. Second, just to see that governance process for a university, and this is a very well-run board of trustees. Mike Goodwin was the former CEO, and now Sean Scoville, and they both came out of Georgetown and just were great leaders there. And then I would just say the last thing is, I have a passion for my undergraduate school, and I have some experiences because I live in Texas and I went to school in the East Coast, and a lot of the trustees are mainly Oregonians through their career. And so, having the chance to bring some value to them from my experiences has been beneficial. But I'd say overall, just a great preparation for a for-profit board.
And in some ways, I guess things sort of, I don't know if I want to use the word spiraled, but sort of took off exponentially from there, because I think we need to talk about the power of networks, and we will see this on some of the boards and the ways it plays out for you. But you talked about very quickly some very senior roles that you had on major organizations, large companies, public companies, and I'm sure the people that you were connecting with, just doing really well in your day job, being a great person, were very helpful when you led well, I guess as we look back now and see yourselves on some of the boards that you were on, led as a result of some of the experiences, right? Prologis led to the REIT, where you're a director now, right?
Right. And actually, it was one of my clients at CBRE and Trammell Crow. It was Behringer Harvard was the original REIT, and Bob Eisner was my client. And then in 2010, as I was going to do other things, consulting in the real estate business and founding Forward, we were on an airplane together. And he said, "Hey, I'd love for you to think about joining our board." And I said, "Love to." And that was the beginning of a board that I have now served on for 10 years, which is Lightstone Real Estate Investment Trust Fund 5, which is a publicly held real estate investment trust.
And I think that's something that people get confused about, is that the idea that your network can be that powerful, that someone who remembers you and knows the quality of work really just makes an introduction. And you made it sound so simple, Diane. Of course, there was more to it than that, and there's more of an interview process. But it was like, hey, I think you'd be a fit Hey, I'm interested. Great. Let's have a discussion. As opposed to people that are sort of working really hard to make new connections and new opportunities and unsurface those. So, for example, one of the other big boards that you're on, the Stan Johnson Company, I believe that came from the Trammell Crow Company relationship, right?
Yes, great memory. Stan was starting his business, and he was placing debt, and I was doing a development deal for Miller Brewing in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Stan actually put the debt on that deal, and that's actually how I met the CEO of Prologis, who ended up to me my boss later, was he provided the actual debt, and Stan made the connection. So, the one thing I would just say, which I do share with a lot of groups that I speak with, is your network is not business cards you pass out. It's relationships that you've built over time that you keep in touch with, because Stan and I really hadn't been in close touch for about 20 years, and he reached out to me, and I helped him with a new president for his company, and then that started our conversations, and then he said, I'd love for you to consider being on my advisory board, which, as you said, definitely is a process. You always take time to get to know the other board members. They want to get to know you, make sure there's a fit. Also, make sure you have the capacity so you can do a great job. And I had to actually step down from it was a small privately held board, before I joined Stan's board, because I felt like that I wanted to make sure I had capacity so I could do a great job.
So, Diane, you've got all of these sort of plates spinning, right? And it starts to get pretty busy. You have a whole portfolio in addition to what you're doing running forward. And another big one that I would say, and I'd love to point out, is when people think about nonprofit boards, I think there's quite a range of experiences. You can join a local mom and pop if that's your first one, and it can be something you're really passionate about and give back to. And I think people who are, I don't want to use the word Machiavellian, but being really careful about which places they use their limited time on, the right boards. I would still say one that you're really passionate about is a good fit, but ideally it could be a well-networked and connected board. You are on one of those. So when I think about the Salvation Army's National Advisory Board, when you pull up the roster of people on there, it's incredibly impressive for an amazing organization doing a lot of good in the world as well. How did something like that come about?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it goes back to my days at Oregon State. A gentleman who I call him, he was just a boy wonder. He was 3 years younger than me, and ended up going from Oregon State to Harvard Business School straight, which typically that does not happen. They usually ask you to have 2 years of work experience. And his name is Rob Pace, and we got reconnected at Harvard Business School because he was only 1 year behind me. And, we were in touch. And as I decided it was time for me to make a turn in my career, he had also decided it was time. He was at Goldman Sachs and actually was supposed to be the successor to Hank Paulson before Hank left for the Treasury. And Rob said, hey, I want you to join me at this breakfast in Portland, Oregon. The Salvation Army has their National Advisory Board meeting quarterly, and I'd love for you to come. And I said, you were right on. I said to him, Rob, I have too much on my plate. And he goes, no, just come to the breakfast. And I'll tell you that it just hit me in the heart to hear the work of the Salvation Army and how they're serving those in poverty, addiction, homelessness. And I thought, okay, God, I think you're telling me this is a way to really give back in a way you haven't had a chance to do before. And you're right, that board is a new group of friends. Only Rob was a previous, relationship of mine, but the amazing new group is, from the former Chief Marketing Officer of Walmart, the former head of Global Marketing and Strategy for General Mills. So now I can call them like they're just some of my closest friends, which they are. And that network is just invaluable, plus just being able to do something that you really care about.
And Diane, you're clearly very busy, and I think that makes a lot of sense, and a lot of directors are. So maybe you can give some insight to everyone in the room, because I think there's listening to us virtually in the room, right? So everyone has an idea like, I want to get on a board, and there's getting a sense for what that looks and feels like, and you're on your first board. Let's say you've landed a paid board role. Figuring out how do you do that well, consolidate your experiences, become really good at it. And then some people go, you know what, I'd like to do more of these. And eventually maybe I want to have a portfolio. This is tough stuff to do. Some of these boards are scheduled multiple years in advance. Can you give us a sense of what it's like for you and how you make all of this actually work?
Yeah, it is. It's definitely a balancing act, and you have to reevaluate all the time. So I did mention, when I first had left the full-time corporate world with Prologis, I was just getting my feet wet. And, I was talking with Behringer Harvard, which became the Lightstone board, and I was serving on a privately held company, and some of the not-for-profit boards started happening. And I thought, I need to step off. I've served for 3 years. I need to step off this privately held company headquartered in Portland, Oregon. And so I think you just have to continually reevaluate what works for you and what doesn't. And I even just shared with my husband this last week that, I'm involved with 3 very influential and also, something I'm passionate about, women, empowering women in the workplace that are actually not faith-based. There are 2020 women on boards, and Women's Business Collaborative, and also C200, which is a group of women that have managed over a $250 million portfolio. And I basically said to him, this next year I need to drop one of those 3 organizations because, I just want to be able to have an impact. And when you have too much on your calendar so that you can't take time to really give value back, then it's time to reevaluate.
I think that's a good perspective, and I imagine he was probably going, no, that's great. I'll get a little more time with my wife. So I'm sure he was okay with that too. But let's carry on the time theme for a second, and I would love your thoughts on this because I know you and I have talked offline about sort of, I don't know if I want to say negotiations, but the compensation involved in the board work when you get into it. And there's not just the compensation for your time that you're there, but there's a lot of other time. Imagine you are on a board, let's say in another part of the country, maybe even part of the world, traveling to get to the board meetings can add up. There's a cost to yourself in terms of opportunity costs, other things. How does that come into play when you are considering maybe not necessarily past opportunities, but if you're considering a future opportunity?
Yeah, it is really important. Actually, as you can imagine, there's some blessings and benefits out of COVID, and that's actually been one of them, is that, it's a lot easier for me to be on a Lightstone board call from 8 until 12 versus flying to New York, staying in a hotel, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the reality is you really do have to think through the whole time commitment. And not only is there travel time and board time, there's board prep time so you can be a valued board member. And then there's also calls that come up that you need to have conference calls between board meetings because there's, a decision to be made. So, being very focused on where the board actually meets is an important thing to do as you consider all of your commitments and you try to figure out what do you have the ability to invest in from a time perspective.
I think that's very good advice for everybody to consider. We only all have 24 hours in the day, multiplied by whatever time period you're talking about. And whether you forego sleep or other things you're choosing to forego, you have to make those decisions somehow in prioritization. But I know compensation is also something that I get asked about a lot from our audienceship, and they would love to hear more about it. And I know it's something that you have been thinking about as sort of, if I had known this back when I started, I might have done this differently, but certainly maybe we'll do it differently going forward. How would you encourage our audience to think about, the first board role comes up, and I would often say, don't just take it because it's your first board role. Wait for a good board role where it actually suits you and you'll do really well, because that will probably lead to success. But it's a complicated set of factors where you decide whether it's the right fit or not. Compensation is probably one of those things. It would make sense, whether you're talking about a public company, private company, whatever it is. What are your thoughts around how someone should figure out the best fit for them in that specific category?
Yeah. I would just say that, first of all, educate yourself to understand, what is the size of this company as far as from a revenue and a net income perspective. And there's lots of information out there around board compensation and what you would expect for a certain size of board. And I would really encourage you not to go into a situation where a board is way under what sort of the average market is, because that probably tells you something, that they don't value their board members as much as you want them to value you. And so I would just say, the first publicly held board that I was on, I didn't do that, and I didn't understand that. And then as I got more educated, three of the other board members and myself, so there were four of us, we got together and we talked about, we're actually not being paid at market for the work that we're doing. And we approached the CEO of the company, and they did adjust our compensation. But that is a harder conversation to have later than prior, because you're there to represent the shareholders, and there's a little bit of a balancing act of, we need to be paid this much. However, we're here to represent the shareholders. So I just say having that done up front, so you go into it with that taken care of is a better way to go than I did on my first board.
That's good advice. And let me also expand that out. Let's just call it due diligence in general around an opportunity. So someone is presented with their first board possibility, and they're very excited. They've been working on this for several years, building up the right network and the position of authority to be landing that position. You have been in several different types of boards where you probably look back and go, now I see that. I didn't know it at the time. I'd be aware of that next time. How does someone go about kicking the tires in the right way to make sure it's a fit? Because I liken it all to dating. You want to make sure it's a fit on both sides. And it can be much harder to do, say, in a private company opportunity versus public company. But what's your best practice advice around due diligence?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I sort of have a three-step process. So the first one is, can I provide the value they're looking for? So just evaluate myself first, because you don't want to go onto a board where you don't feel like you can provide value. And so that's number one. Can I provide value that they don't already have someone on their board that has that that gifting to give them? And then the second is, get to know all the board members. Pretty much in every case, as on the publicly held boards, there was a conversation with every board member. And they have an opportunity to say, I think Diane would be a good fit or wouldn't be a good fit. And I interviewed with other companies that I'm not on their board and was not asked to be on their board. One that wanted a sitting CEO, and I've never been a sitting CEO. Well, I guess both of them were for that reason. And so you want to take time to talk to all the board members and ask them the really important questions to you. And I think the other question that everybody should ask is, how do the board members get along? I mean, that's really important because sometimes there's going to be situations that are pretty tough, and you have to all trust and work with each other very well, or it could be not a good situation. So the second is really get to know the board members, really spend time so they can get to know you, and then really understand the dynamics of the board. And then I would say if all that works, then the third would be, okay, does this fit with my priorities? And we've talked about that earlier, of really understanding what is really important to you in your life and how does this fit with that, so that, if it really doesn't fit, even if the first two boxes are checked, you really shouldn't do it.
So, Diane, that all makes a lot of sense, and it's very logical. And so someone hears this advice and they go, great, I'll take a hold of this as part of my due diligence. So let's say, fictitiously, one of the boards that you're on is looking for a new member. Someone is coming out and doing their due diligence, wanting to connect to the other board members. I would love to hear your thoughts on that scenario, but also just sort of in general, where people are trying to do the networking to grow their opportunity set. I've seen some really bad examples recently that have landed in my inbox or my LinkedIn messaging from people that are almost a little bit too aggressive on that. What are the right ways that you will be recipient of a message that you receive and you're like, that's great, I would love to spend a little time investing in that person, seeing what they're like and how to give it back? Because I'm sure you've been a recipient of some that have been really good. You're like, that's great. And others are like, I don't know that I really want to go there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would just say that, the key is really getting to know people and build relationships with them. If you're pursuing being a part of boards, and right now, Alexander, I know you're involved and I'm involved with 20 women on boards, which is going to be 50-50 women on boards as the future goal. And I invited a group of women to be at my table who I know have capabilities and aspirations to become board members, and having them meet each other, plus giving them a chance to see women who actually serve on boards. So I've actually asked one of my friends, Kim Dixon, who is the global COO of FedEx Office, who serves on 2 corporate boards, to actually be the coach in the breakout group with the 11 women that are a part of my table at this, so that they can get some knowledge from somebody other than myself. And then I can also see how they interact, because, being too aggressive is probably a red flag. If people are a great fit, they provide value, and they've done their due diligence to really understand the board members, and the board members have done the same, it's going to be a good fit. But if you're so aggressive that you're not paying attention to warning signs, then the worst thing you can do is get on a board and it doesn't work at all.
And I imagine that the opportunity to give back is really encouraging for the position that you're in. But let's look at that in a slightly different way. So you have an organization that you're leading in addition to your board work, where you are clearly bringing people around into your orbit, whether it's an advisory board or a full board, however you want to think about it. As you have these experience having sat on other boards, what do you now look for the right sort of characteristics to bring someone into that circle to be an advisor for you?
Yeah, it's really important, and I'll tell you, right when I founded Forward, it was all about skill set. What is the skill set that they have that I don't have? So, some of it was somebody that had a really strong theological background, or someone that had a really strong technology background, because I knew that we were going to need to have someone strong in social media for the audience that we were targeting. today it's a little different. So we're 9 years old now, going on 10. And today, because of our size, it's really important for me to have, and I just brought her on last year, a CFO of a Fortune 500 company. So the things you need do change over time, and that's the great thing you can do is set up board terms so that as you need to evolve, you have the opportunity without a awkward situation of bringing in the right people and having the people that have gone through their terms just retire off the board gracefully because they brought the skill set you needed at the time, but now you have new skill sets you need. And I hope that all makes sense.
It does. And, Diane, what I'd also love is, for example, we're both involved 22 women on boards. We're seeing a lot more diversity in the boardroom being a very normal part of the discussion. I'd love if you could sort of pull out your crystal ball and look down the road for me and say, what do you think is changing in the boardroom? Clearly, there's more emphasis on diversity, but we've seen during COVID that perhaps like chief HR officer needs are being elevated. People going, I've got to manage the workforce in a different way now. We might need that sort of skill set. We know cyber demand and interest in that from the boards has gone through the roof, and risk management. When you look down the road and go, I can see this from some of the organizations I'm working with, or this is what I'm reading about, what are some of the other changes do you think that are coming?
Yeah, I loved what Melinda Gates said on the global conference call. She said, sort of get that C vocabulary out of your speak because there's so many skill sets that are so helpful today. She talked about, you need someone with a DEI background on your board. You need millennials on your board. You also, a general counsel who's dealt with a lot of issues could be really helpful to have on your board. So I think that I'm hoping that the world of thinking someone has to have a C in their title, chief operating officer or chief executive officer or CFO, before they could be a great board member, really helps companies be a lot more diversified in dealing with things that come up, and having that expertise will be so beneficial.
I would agree, and I think there was a propensity where you needed to be a sitting or retired CEO to be on a board, and then they diversified by adding the CFO, sitting or retired CFO. And I don't disagree that you need someone, maybe two people of that sort of ilk on your board, but you don't need everybody to have those. You need more varied experience, and you should be using those other seats strategically in order to add the skill sets that you need. And it's encouraging to hear how your experiences have changed sort of your mindset and your approach, and clearly you're paying that forward to the next group of other people, helping them think about how they position themselves forward, and that's helpful for all of our audience here. And I just want to come back a little bit to your organization and the great work that you guys are doing. And you and I were talking before the show how you celebrated the success of the event that you had in September, and even during a different time than we would have had a year ago. I'd been talking about it was very successful. And I know you've got a big event coming up in February. Can you tell us about that as well?
Yes, and what we've seen is, number one, safety is critical. And so we did bring 48 C-level women together in September, but we had a very strict COVID protocol. And we even had armbands, so you could wear a red one if you really didn't want anyone to even get within 6 feet of you, and everyone had masks on, a yellow if you're comfortable having someone close to you, and a green if you're willing to hug. So, setting up procedures and protocols I think are really important. So safety first, but second, as a lot of us have heard, mental health is so important right now. So many people have been isolated, and we've seen if you take care of safety first and then bring people together in a responsible way, the impact from a mental and spiritual perspective is huge. So I wanted to set it up that way before I told you what we were doing, because some people say, really, you're going to do this? But we have a gala the end of February 27th in Dallas, Texas at the Omni Hotel, that we have Mary Lou Retton, 5-time gold medalist, Olympian in gymnastics, being interviewed by Molly Fletcher, the female Jerry Maguire, and she is an amazing interviewer and storyteller. And they're going to, talk about, how to be a leader and how to perform with excellence. But we will have, half the people at each table that would have been last year. We have a room that's 3 times as large as we had last year, so that we make sure also that we have that balance between safety and giving people something that gives them a mental and spiritual uplift and encouragement.
Well, obviously, we hope for the best for a phenomenal event for you, and it's hard to do any events well these days, but I'm sure there are people that are just excited at the possibility of getting back and doing something in person, getting off of Zoom a little bit. And even though that we were virtual today, I just felt like we were in the room together, and we were delighted to have you on the show today, Diane. Thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Well, thank you, Alexander, and I love the work that you're doing, so let me know when I can help you in any way.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Diane Pattison. I love the story of someone who did well in their job and that reputation precedes them, because we all know we need to network. Here's a good example of how being in touch and intentionally with those contacts, keeping them alive, can lead to the other opportunities, but also how she has built a thriving nonprofit board situation where she is giving back to other people, but a lot of that's come because of her network. So again, the networking portion, we heard how important that was today. And remember, if you head over to podcast.gord.edu, you will find links to everything we talked about today. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.